Right, let's take a look at task E. So in the pre-release information, we find there Ryan speaking about a potential acquisition of Elgin schools, and then he then speaks about a due diligence. He identifies the purpose of this due diligence as being to basically go about determining a fair acquisition price for these schools. He then hints at wanting to draw at your audit skills, and then let's see what was provided on the day. So in the information on the day, you get told that the due diligence will relate to the 2021 financial performance. Ryan speaks about a credible or requiring an assurance level similar to that of an audit. And then he then says that we have management's accounts available from Jan to November 2021. He then suggests a few procedures, and he then scopes in these 3 line items: revenue, tuition fees, employee costs, and other operating costs. Now, as part of your task, you're required to review, document the concerns that you have with regard to Ryan's procedures, and you're also required to describe further key procedures. Now, one thing that would have helped you is to understand what the risk associated with this particular task is. So with regard to revenue, we're looking specifically at testing the overstatement of revenue, and vice versa for employee costs and other operating costs. So it goes without saying that the direction of testing then would have been crucial in you demonstrating competence for this task. Let's take a look at a few sample responses.
Let's have a look at a competent candidate. So firstly, what we can see here is that this candidate has already addressed the line items that was provided by Ryan. So we see revenue, we see employee cost, and then we see the other operating costs. So already this candidate has dealt with the requirements by addressing all 3 line items. The question is, however, that has the candidate provided sufficient or appropriate responses, and that we will see just now. So when we look at the revenue line item, we can clearly see that the risk of overstatement has been identified. So the fact that they can overstate their revenue in order to overstate their profit. So that's a very good concern for the revenue line item. This candidate then says the procedure is a good start, but then we need to do a little bit more, especially then also as there's rebates and discounts. So for revenue as a line item, this candidate has provided a few, meaning 2 valid concerns, and well explained of why this is a problem or what could the problem be. Then the candidate discusses a little bit further that there will be procedures done on a monthly basis, but we still need to see a little bit more of how this procedure is performed or what exactly is the procedure. But then luckily this candidate says to address the occurrence mentioned above, we should select a sample of high, medium, and low value revenue and trace it to the bank statement in order to ensure that it occurred. So already giving us a valid procedure to test the occurrence of revenue. There's also some other valid procedures by looking at the number of candidates in this calculation, or sorry, the number of students, and then also the fee that has been approved or has been communicated to the parents or to the learners. But that's sufficient. Ryan said further key procedures. So for us already mentioning a procedure addressing the occurrence, this candidate has already provided us with enough detail over revenue. Moving to employee cost, we see that this candidate once again notices that employee cost could be understated. So seeing that link between revenue being overstated and the expenses being understated, making them sure that the profit could be understated because of this employee cost. So technically, if you think about it, if employee cost is understated, the profit could be overstated, but we sort of forgive this candidate because they could still see that the expense could be understated. Then we look at the procedure. So once again, there's a nice procedure, but then we see here that the candidate suggests that we randomly select an employee on the premise and trace their ID number, name, and surname to the payroll report. So from here, the direction is clear that they're starting from the source, which is the physical employee, and going to the payroll report. But just verifying the ID number, the name, and the surname is not going to give us that comfort that the employee cost amount is complete. It's more just going to give us detail that the employee itself has been included in the payroll, but we don't have that comfort over the amount. But then this candidate goes further and says we should agree the amount as per the payroll report to the management account. So here we can clearly see the direction from the source to the record. So the source in this case being the payroll report to the management accounts that Ryan had been provided with. So now we can see that they do understand the direction of testing completeness for the understatement of the employee cost. Then for other operating costs, we see here that the candidate notices that it's the same, it's still an expense, so we have that risk of understatement. Then talking a little bit about the prior figure, but we can't get the comfort that this candidate really understands why we can't compare the prior year to the current year. But that's okay, because we've already seen some nice coverage over the 3 line items. Later on, we see this procedure of selecting a sample of transaction from the physical file and tracing it to the accounting record. The question is, what is selected? So in this case, this procedure is not valid. It's not a great procedure because it's not clear what the starting point is. But we can forgive this candidate because we could still see that this candidate looked at the different procedures. They've identified the specific risks linked to a due diligence, which shows us that they did their research on a due diligence, and then also provided valid key procedures for these specific risks.
Let's look at another sample script. Just a reminder that you can only get a competent response if you address all aspects of the task. So for this task, you were asked specifically to identify concerns and provide further audit procedures. Secondly, you have to engage with the information on the day to be competent. You cannot provide generic responses or generic answers, and you need to recognize what the purpose of the task is. So based on what we've already explained to you, it's evident that this task was a due diligence and the risk was the overstatement of revenue and the understatement of expenses. So in terms of the generic responses, we're not looking for general procedures. So we're looking for specific procedures speaking to the 3 line items that have been scoped in on the day, being revenue, employee cost, and the other operating expenses, including bad debts. So when we look at this response, first of all, the candidate did identify concerns, first of all, and secondly, provided some further audit procedures. So addressing the aspects of the task. But however, we need to establish if there's sufficient engagement with the information on the day and whether there are not generic responses. So when we look at the concerns being raised by the candidate, it states that however, it can be noted that if we are considering using the work of a professional expert in the due diligence, we must evaluate the competence, capability, and objectivity. So that is the extent of the concern. However, on the day, for each of the line items, there have been concerns that should have been identified. So this is a very generic comment. And it's also not true in the context because on the day, it stated very specifically that Archegos is going to do the due diligence themselves. So there's not going to be reliance on a professional expert. So in terms of the concerns, a concern has not been raised. This is a generic concern, as well as this concern is not speaking to the information on the day. So this is the only concern being identified by the candidate. So the concerns have not been appropriately addressed on the day. Then the candidate provides some further audit procedures, starts off with general procedures. Once again, this leans toward a general answer, whereas the information on the day was very specific. So this candidate identified the need to request financial statements, to investigate disclosures, and to obtain a management rep letter, which is not a due diligence procedure, that's an audit procedure. So by looking at these 3 procedures, these are very generic, almost leading towards pre-prepared response and not speaking to what the risk is on the day. However, the candidate does then bring in the 3 different line items. So there you'll see revenue, and on the next page, employee cost and operating cost. So now we need to assess whether these procedures speak to the information provided on the day. So the candidate starts off by requesting a cash flow analysis. Then it speaks about prior sales, which already indicates that the candidate is not engaging with the context, because we referring to a school which have tuition fees and school fees. So, I mean, what sales is the candidate referring to? And then there's an incomplete sentence. So that's the extent of the procedures or revenue. However, on the day, it was clear that Ryan is suggesting that there should be almost an analytical review of the tuition fees, whereby the number of learners is multiplied with the annual tuition fees and compared to the tuition fee recorded in the financial year in 2021. So none of these procedures are addressing what has been provided on the day. So all of these procedures, cash flow analysis, very generic, not speaking to the information on the day. Then when we look at employee cost, the first issue with this response is that the candidate is clearly not identifying what the risk is, that the risk is the understatement of employee cost. So the candidate refers to what is the current compensation payable, is this market related, and what are the benefits, pension fund planning, funding, leave benefits payable by Archegos. However, we are considering the Elgin School and the management accounts of Elgin School. So speaking about Archegos is not relevant. And speaking about current compensation, whether it's market related, once again is generic and does not speak to the risk. And the risk is assessing whether the employee cost that Elgin currently has in their management accounts, is that employee cost actually complete, that they account for all employee cost. So once again, not speaking the information on the day. Other operating costs, the procedures suggested is once again very generic. It speaks about investigating other operating costs for any high or unusual amounts that have been paid, inquire what the costs are made up of, what are the trends, load them onto an Excel spreadsheet. So no demonstration by the candidate that there's engagement with the OPEX reflected for the Elgin School. So what the candidate had to recognize is that you cannot perform procedures on the operating cost line item as it is. You need to disaggregate those line items based on the unique characteristics of the expense line items. And this is not coming through in the response. And the candidate also did not recognize that bad debts is currently a high risk area for schools, for Archegos and for Elgin. So within the context of this case study, specific procedures had to be performed on the bad debts because of all the challenges that the schools faced after the COVID-19. So this is also not coming through in the response. So if we summarize this candidate's response, the candidate did not engage sufficiently with the information on the day. The candidate also provided very generic audit procedures or generic procedures. It leans towards audit procedures and not really due diligence procedures addressing the risk on the day. And the candidate clearly did not understand that we are dealing with a due diligence and that the risk is very specific when we look at the possible acquisition of the Elgin School. And to conclude, the candidate also did not identify concerns with the suggested procedures on the day. So therefore, this candidate demonstrated limited competence in his response.
All right, let's take a look at a highly competent candidate. So what you'll appreciate about this candidate is that they have a very nice introduction, saying to Ryan, you know, we wouldn't really want to suffer any negative consequences because we didn't do enough research. They then start off by saying, I'd like to explain what my understanding of a due diligence is. So this would be a candidate who did thorough research on due diligence as a process and now wants to show the examiner that they actually understand what's going on. So they do speak about the fact that, okay, we're trying to assess, for example, if sufficient value exists in justifying whether we'd like to proceed with this transaction. They then go on to say, you know, it's not enough to just look at the numbers in your apps. We also want to take into account some qualitative factors, which they go on to describe there. And then this candidate also says that, you know, repeating themselves basically that they want to perform a due diligence on the non-financial aspects, such as operational and legal matters. They then go on to say that the reason that they're doing this is because they'd like to ensure that the entity is sustainable long-term. So they therefore need to have a holistic view of this process. So just right off of the bat, I have a warm, fuzzy feeling that this candidate understands what a due diligence is. Now to then see if they then properly address the task. So if we look at whether they've addressed concerns or not, they have broken down their answer into two. We see the concerns there. We also see the further key procedures at the bottom. They've also addressed all line items, revenue, employee costs, other operating costs, and they've also done the same with the procedures as well. Now let's get into the actual meat of what they're saying to see if it does actually make sense or not. So for revenue, in terms of concerns, this candidate says that, you know, he's very concerned that we place a lot of reliance on the fact that the learner numbers are correct. And he also speaks about the fact that, you know, you've also previously spoken about granting settlement discounts to other parents. I don't see this impact being factored into the procedures that you've planned. So that is a very valid concern that they're raising. For employee costs, they say, you know, we have not performed any form of employee verification to ensure that the employee included in the management accounts exist. This is concerning. It's interesting. He says that this is concerning, or she says that this is concerning because this whole procedure is also concerning to us. From a direction of testing perspective, this candidate is not testing understatement. And if this is the only thing that they would have had, they would have not been awarded a tick, as it were, for addressing concerns on employee costs. But let's see if they have other things that they maybe address. So this candidate says, furthermore, merely having a discussion with the CEO regarding identified differences is not sufficient. We need to ensure that we corroborate the explanations with supporting evidence. Now they get to something. They identify the fact that, you know, just asking the CEO for some information wouldn't be enough. You need to dig a bit deeper, which is actually a valid concern. So we forgive them for the little boo-boo here at the start. Now, for other operating costs, they say that with regard to the procedures, we're just performing a comparison. And this candidate says this may not be appropriate because then Elgin may have incurred once-off costs in 2020 relating to COVID-19, and thus the 2021 financial information may not be comparable, as the same costs may not be incurred during the 2021 financial year. So this actually demonstrates very good insight, because you'll appreciate that in 2020, at the start of COVID, there were some costs that, like for sanitizing and, you know, buying of masks and so on and so forth, that wouldn't necessarily have been such a big cost in 2021, for example, because maybe people were vaccinated and we got to understand the disease a bit better. So that is also then a valid concern that this candidate is raising. So let's look at the key procedures. So for revenue, candidate says, you know, I would obtain a listing of learners from the learner administrative system and confirm that we have valid details for the learner and its parent. And in addition to this, I would actually verify the existence of a learner through a school visit. This is a very, very good procedure that actually gives us evidence over the number of learners, which was a concern that this candidate had actually highlighted earlier on in the argument. As a next procedure, they then say that they'd make inquiries from management about the percentage of learners who generally receive early settlement discounts. Okay. They would then formulate a substantive analytic whereby we determine the amount of learners who generally receive early settlement discounts based on the prior year. So they do attempt to do some procedures on settlement discount, but we're not really seeing a source where they, well, if you don't count the inquiry, where they actually verify the amount of settlement discounts. So perhaps, you know, contracts or some agreements that they may have had with parents. So this would have been, you know, on the fence kind of procedure at this point. But we already have a valid procedure for number of learners on top. So that's already quite good. Then they say perform a detailed testing on the rebate expenditure by selecting a sample of learners who receive the rebate and ascertain whether there is supporting documentation for these learners and the rebate amount that is accurate. So this is also, again, quite theoretical, because whether there is supporting documentation, what does that mean? What kind of supporting documentation are you looking for? Is it a contract, an invoice, a letter? So maybe the candidate should have been a bit more specific here. Then they say inquires to the number of learners that they indicated that they will terminate their studies at the school at the end of 2021 and inspect the file of accepted new applications for 2022. Now, this is a procedure that demonstrates that this candidate thoroughly understands due diligence, as they actually said in the introduction. So they're now saying we're looking at the sustainability of the earnings. So it's good and well that we have these financials that say revenue or tuition revenue is going to be at this point, but do we have evidence supporting the fact that from 2022 and beyond, that will actually be the case? When we now look at employee costs, the candidate says that they're going to obtain an understanding of how employee costs is calculated. They're going to attempt to recalculate all of this using the appropriate inputs, and then they're going to follow up, for example, if there are any differences. And then once they've done that, they're going to agree their calculation with what's actually in the management records, and then they're going to follow up. So overall, a very solid procedure that this candidate is doing, understands very well the direction of testing in this particular instance. For other operating costs, including bad debts, so they say that they were going to obtain an understanding of, you know, the bad debt write-off policy and assess the reasonability of that. Based on that understanding, they would then recalculate bad debts, and they would do this by making use of a debtor's age analysis. And then they go on to say that they would select a sample of bad debt write-off and inspect the correspondence between Algin and the parent to ensure that the bad debt has been written off and that it has been written off at the correct amount. So overall, if you look at the actual line item, other operating costs, I would be convinced that this candidate, you know, understands the fact that in order to, for example, to address completeness, they would need to make sure that it is reasonable. And that is how you pick up, for example, if the operating costs would have been understated. Is it reasonable with what we know about the company? Is it reasonable with what I've now done with my own calculation using information that management would have had readily available? So overall, they've, you know, ticked the box for other operating costs quite well. Employee costs they've ticked, and revenue they've also been able to cover, even though some of their procedures were actually weak. Then they go on to discuss the ethical dilemma that was present in the question. So what this candidate then speaks about, he says that, you know, it's all nice and well that we have this PA who wants to give us information in return for her job. However, the candidate says, you know, it creates certain issues. So firstly, he says it highlights a tone of unethical behavior in which she's willing to disclose even private information to us. Now, this candidate is reaching because this wasn't really outlined like this in the scenario, but let's just read on to see what else they say. They say, secondly, it seems to highlight that the personal assistant is desperate to keep her job, which brings into question whether employees at Elgin feel secure and safe in their positions or whether their employment is threatened, right? Then the candidate goes on to say, I don't believe that exploiting the personal assistant for any information is ethical or right. And in addition, I'm very hesitant to use her as a source of information wherever possible, quoting Ryan's exact words, because he says, as I'm not sure if we can rely on her credibility given the above. So you have to read the whole response and take that into consideration with what he's discussing here, or she is discussing here. And then he also says he's particularly concerned because the information that we get is basically in exchange for job security. So he also, or she touches on this ethical aspect quite well. It seems fairly balanced. It's substantiated with regard to the reasoning. And that is why we assess this candidate as being highly competent.